Mark from the States, Mark from the States, it's Mark from the United States.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, Mark from the States. How we doing today? I'm doing fantastic. I hope you are as well. Thank you so much for coming. I've got this big fake couch here. Come on aboard. Today we're going to look at a history chap video. Chris over there, of course, has been a huge supporter of our channel, so I appreciate him and thank him for allowing us to watch and learn from his videos. Ever so entertaining, and of course get to learn new things and new things about old things, I guess is how that works. A lot of you I know watch him. This has come requested. It is the Great Storm of 1703. Now, I know you're having some real bad weather right now. This video was a month ago, so at the time there was a big storm going on as well, and so we're going to dip back and allow Chris to discuss something that happened quite a long time ago, but it had, from what I'm understanding, serious ramifications on history. So, if you have one like and one subscription to give today, please give it to Chris and his History Chap channel. It's real important that you do too. This video, of course, has come requested. The links below, if you just scroll down, right? We all should probably know where those are by now, but one goes to his channel, one goes to this video, and you know the rest of the story. Please get over there and support him. It's really important that you do so, and I know a lot of you already do, and that's what makes our channel and all of you channel family members so special. So get over there and help him out, and then watch with me so I can learn as well. All right, let's get into it. This is the Great Storm of 1703.
This very week, Britain has been battered by Storm Bert. But it was also in this week, over 300 years ago, that the island was hit by its most deadly storm. On the night of the 26th of November 1703, over 10,000 people were killed. 13 Royal Navy warships were destroyed. Windmills caught fire. Cows ended up in trees. And even the Queen had to flee for her life.
Oh my gosh.
This is the story of the Great Storm of 1703. The British love to talk about the weather, and it's played a large part in our history.
Sure.
Julius Caesar was almost stranded on the hostile island 2,000 years ago when his invasion fleet was destroyed in a storm. William the Conqueror was almost not a conqueror because storms kept his fleet in Normandy. And a so-called Protestant wind blew and destroyed the mighty Spanish Armada. Even in the Second World War, Dwight Eisenhower almost cancelled D-Day because of adverse weather conditions. And many of us will remember the announcement in 1987 when BBC weather forecaster Michael Fish famously dismissed a viewer's alarm that a hurricane was heading towards Britain. But she was right, and he was wrong. That night a storm with gusts of up to 134 miles an hour hit southern England, killing about 20 people. It was the worst storm to hit Britain in 300 years. But that previous storm, way back in 1703, was a far more terrifying, destructive and lethal beast. It would leave 10,000 dead in its wake and 13 Royal Navy warships destroyed, including the whole Channel Squadron, just when England was at war with France.
Yeah, initially I would think storms today, which some may even say are stronger because of climate change or other factors. But it seems like maybe as a human race we're more able to withstand certain things based on our buildings that are constructed. You know, people can seek shelter. The flooding, we have, even though you do see massive flooding and damage and all that stuff, but the loss of life generally isn't as great because of certain things. They can, alleviate a lot of those issues nowadays, I guess. I don't know. I'm not an expert, obviously, but just you do see in history these storms have such an effect on, especially on ship construction or other, stuff like that. Also, let me just dart out to say, recovery of these storms seem, nowadays we can rebuild, we can keep commerce going in a certain way. Yes, it does take an effect and cause a lot of problems. And, there's a lot of money lost, but as compared to the old days, I mean, we can get industries back up and running or somehow have some sort of protection, against these natural disasters. So, I mean, there's so much, we're obviously as a human race so much better capable of dealing with these. Still, you still see storms today, though, that are just, that even some that aren't like as huge as this would be, like a hurricane per se. Just for instance, the ones that we had here a few months back in North Carolina and stuff. I mean, the hurricane, you're expecting it to hit Florida, and that's where the damage would be because it's at its strongest. But as it carried up through through the country and getting into North Carolina, just the rain, the amount of water, that seems to be where the damage really is. You're going to have that the initial impact of wind and all that stuff, waves hitting the coast. You think, oh, they're going to be damaged, but in the long run, it's all the water from rain hitting these areas that just aren't used to it. And that's where even still today, North Carolina, Western North Carolina is struggling. So yeah, it's the water. When you talk about these storms, it's the flooding in the water. It just causes the most damage. Of course, we're not going to lose the ships that, especially the ships that were constructed at this time. But yeah, just crazy.
And even the monarch, Queen Anne, had to flee before its fury. The 26th of November...
I will say, though, cows seem to always end up in trees no matter what point in history, it sounds like.
1703.
Poor
and
cows.
For the previous 2 weeks, the weather had been getting worse. Winds had been getting stronger and stronger, and the seas getting angrier in the process. And those winds coming from the southwest were creating, metaphorically, a perfect storm that would in no small part result in the massive loss of life and shipping. Because those powerful winds were pushing all the sailing ships that were coming towards England from America and the West Indies and the Mediterranean faster home than they usually would. But those powerful winds were also preventing ships sailing in the opposite direction. So what southern England and Wales had by the 26th of November 1703 was a complete and utter traffic jam in her ports and estuaries.
We never even think of that. Ships using the wind, needing the wind. If it's blowing really hard in one direction, how do you sail the opposite? Yeah, didn't even think of the issues that would cause. Interesting.
Just for good measure, Britain was at war with France in the War of the Spanish Succession. Now, I won't go into that war now, but suffice to say that the Battle of Blenheim was one of Britain's high points in this conflict. So now, all those merchant ships were jostling for safety, alongside dozens of Royal Navy warships, some being ready for protection, others for action against the Spanish at Cadiz, and still more providing escorts for some of those merchantmen. For instance, there was a convoy of 120 ships, plus a Royal Navy escort, stuck at Milford Haven in southwest Wales, whilst a further 80 ships were waiting to put to sea up in the Humber estuary. And it wasn't just ports and estuaries where these ships were seeking refuge. Many had weighed anchor off the coast too. As an example, off the coast of Norfolk is a reasonably shallow area called the Yarmouth Roads, and there over 400 ships were waiting to set sail. Meanwhile, further down off the coast of Kent is a channel called the Downs. This is a piece of sea between the town of Deal on the coast and the Goodwin Sands. Lying about 3 miles offshore, the Goodwin Sands is a huge sandbank measuring about 10 miles in length by 3 miles wide that's submerged at high tide, but at low tide part of it is exposed. Some locals are known to play cricket matches on the exposed sand to this day. However, those treacherous sands have also claimed hundreds of ships over the years. So we now had more ships than usual stuck in the ports, estuaries and those semi-shallow downs. And the last thing those wooden ships needed was a storm of biblical proportions bearing down on them. But that is exactly what they got on the night of the 26th of November, 1703. That afternoon, people who were watching their barometers suddenly saw a dramatic drop in pressure. In fact, it was so dramatic that Daniel Defoe, who later wrote a book all about the storm, actually thought his children had been playing around with it and had broken it. However, it wasn't the kids. It was heralding that a Force 2 hurricane was about to smash into southern Wales and southern England. The storm hit Britain on a wide front, from Land's End in Cornwall up into mid-Wales. At its northern extremity, it proceeded through the Cotswolds and Midlands and on to East Anglia. To the south, it swept through the southwest peninsula and then along the whole southern coast of England, Hampshire, Sussex, Kent, along with London and Essex, before heading out into the North Sea. Academics from the University of East Anglia estimate that the wind speed as it crossed southern England was somewhere between 87 and 95 miles an hour, which is very similar to that storm of 1987. And out at sea in the English Channel, they estimate that there were gusts of wind of up to 140 miles an hour. The full fury of that storm as it hit the fleet lying at anchor at Milford Haven was recorded by the Commodore of the fleet, Captain Soanes. Guns firing from one ship or other all night for help, and it was impossible to assist each other. The sea was so high. The darkness of the night, such that we could not see where anyone was, but for the flashes of their guns. When daylight appeared, it was a dismal sight to behold. Ships without masts, some sunk, others upon the rocks, the wind blowing so hard that on the deck a man could not stand without holding. In that darkness, a sailor was swept off the deck of his ship and carried by a huge wave. He was actually dumped on the quarterdeck of a neighbouring vessel.
No way.
That night at Milford Haven, the force of the sea broke HMS Cumberland from her anchor. The mighty winds now started to drive the 80-gun third-rate ship of the line towards the rocks as if she was simply a toy boat. The crew made a makeshift anchor by wrapping ropes around a cannon and desperately shoved it overboard. Amazingly, this DIY anchor held, and disaster was averted. As it made landfall, the great storm of 1703 obliterated woodlands and forests. The New Forest in Hampshire lost 14,000 trees. Daniel Defoe, when he went out into Kent a few weeks later, stopped counting fallen trees when he reached 17,000. 140 barns in Worcestershire were flattened. Meanwhile, once more in Kent, it was estimated that 1,100 houses, outhouses and barns had been destroyed. Churches across the country, from as far apart as Somerset, Oxfordshire and Surrey, took an absolute battering. Steeples came down, lead was ripped off the roofs. Westminster Abbey, Ely Cathedral, Gloucester Cathedral took significant damage. At Dunchurch in Warwickshire, the wind was so powerful that it rolled the lead sheets of the roof up like a carpet. Huge lead sheets, which modern architects estimate would have weighed something like 2,500
pretty
kilograms,
heavy.
or in old currency, about 400 stone, were then lifted off the roof and propelled 50 yards across the churchyard. Houses across the country had their roofs similarly ripped off. In Shaftesbury, Dorset, as her roof started to come off, a woman ran downstairs to get out of her house. However, when she tried to open the door, the wind was so strong that it was actually keeping it shut. So there she was, desperately trying to open her door against the wind, whilst her house was being destroyed above her. In the end, she simply sat down at the bottom of the stairs, praying that she would be saved. And her prayers were answered.
Oh, good.
She survived. Not so lucky, when we're thinking about people with the power of prayer, was the Bishop of Bath and Wells. Richard Kidder, who'd held this senior position in the Church of England since 1691, was taking refuge in the Bishop's palace with his wife when the chimney stack collapsed, killing them both.
Oh, God.
Chimneys at that time were not like the ornamental constructions that they often are today. They were huge, and basically the houses were almost built around them. So consequently, if a chimney stack collapsed, it took a large part of the house with it. And that night in London, over 2,000 chimney stacks collapsed. In between Fleet Street and Strand, a plasterer by the name of Mr. Dyer felt his house starting to shake. Descending the stairs, he ventured outside. However, it was so pitch black that he popped back inside to light a lamp. And at that moment, the chimney stack crashed down, killing him.
No.
Even the royal palace in London wasn't safe. Queen Anne herself had to be rushed down to the cellars of St James's Palace for protection, as the chimney stack started to collapse there too. And outside in St James's Park, a weird phenomenon happened. The wind was so powerful that it was actually plucking fish out of the ponds and throwing them onto the bank. And after the storm, they counted 200 fish on the banks of the ponds in St James's Park. Across the south of England, 400 windmills collapsed or were damaged in this storm. At some point, the wind was driving the windmill sails so fast and the sails turning at such a speed that the friction made them catch fire. At Whitstable in Kent, a boat was lifted from the water's edge and carried 800 feet or 250 metres inland. And later on, after the storm in the same area, they actually found a cow in the branches of a tree. I mentioned the perfect storm earlier in the sense of the winds blowing ships home faster than usual whilst preventing others leaving, resulting in ports and estuaries being almost gridlocked. Well, the weather conditions also created their own perfect storm. As if the wind speeds weren't destructive enough, they just so happened to coincide with a high tide. People reported that sea levels rose 6 to 8 feet higher than anyone could remember in living memory.
Yeah, that's
At
devastating.
Bristol, over 1,000 buildings were destroyed by floodwaters, whilst on the other side of the Severn estuary, Chepstow was under 4 feet of water. The Somerset levels, the old marshlands where King Alfred had hidden from the Danes, had been drained back in the mid-1600s. But now the sea came back to reclaim them, sweeping inland for nearly 6 miles, drowning 15,000 sheep and anywhere between 80 and 200 people. Now, if you're thinking that things are bad
crazy.
on land, and let's face it, they were, it was nothing compared to what was happening at sea. You've already heard of the terrifying experiences of the fleet at Milford Haven. The storm, when it hit Cornwall, came with such force that a small cargo boat at Helford was ripped from her moorings and driven out to sea. Aboard was 1 crewman and 2 terrified boys. For the next 8 hours, they clung to each other as their boat was pushed 200 miles from Cornwall to the Isle of Wight, where it was driven onto the beach by the winds. Still in the West Country, the Eddystone Lighthouse near
That's
Plymouth
lucky.
faced the full fury of the storm. The very first lighthouse, a wooden structure, had only been completed 5 years beforehand. Now it collapsed, killing all 6 occupants. One of the victims was Henry Winstanley, the man who'd actually designed it, and he'd gone out to the lighthouse as the storm broke to see what it would be like. By a strange irony, that same night, 200 miles away in Essex, Winstanley's home was also flattened. And just to rub salt into the wound, once the lighthouse had been destroyed, a ship coming from Virginia called the Winchelsea was wrecked on the rocks where the lighthouse had stood. Further along the south coast in Sussex lay a small fishing village called Brightonstone. We now know it as Brighton. And there on the night of the 26th, 27th of November 1703, a whole street was washed away by the surging sea. In fact, a local resident, Stephen Gawain, described Brighton as looking like it had been bombarded. And actually, that phrase was used time and time again by witnesses in Daniel Defoe's book describing the events of that night. One of the fishing boats from Brighton, called the Happy Entrance, was trying to make her way back to the port when she sank with all hands, bar 1. And that survivor, a man by the name of Walter Street, was found 3 days later, still clinging to the mast, which had been swept 100 miles away around the coast to the Thames estuary.
How?
And just because they were bigger, the Royal Navy didn't fare any better. The Channel Squadron had been anchored at the Downs, in between Deal and the Goodwin Sands in Kent. 5 of those Royal Navy warships foundered on Goodwin Sands that night. Rather like at Milford Haven, a sailor called Miles Northcliffe on a ship that did survive, HMS Shrewsbury, described how in the night you could hear the cannons firing emergency signals, but no one could assist. In fact, you couldn't even see where the other ships were.
I was going to say.
Rear Admiral Beaumont and the entire 500-man crew of HMS Mary were lost. The next morning, the townspeople of Deal looked out at the Goodwin Sands 3.5 miles away. Through their telescopes, they could see hundreds and hundreds of sailors milling around on the sands with no means of escape. And here's one of those moments in history where ordinary people do extraordinary things. The mayor of Deal, Thomas Powell, urged the local customs officers to take their cutter out across the stormy waters to rescue the men. The leading customs officer point blank refused. Going out there in this weather was, he said, suicide. So Powell gathered some townspeople with a promise of a reward of 5 shillings for every sailor saved. They pushed the protesting civil servants aside, seized their boat by force, and then set sail for the Goodwin Sands. Powell and the men of Deal saved 200 sailors, but before they could return, the tide had come in, and the sandbank had disappeared under the water. It's estimated that about 1,500 sailors were drowned off the seas of Kent during this terrible storm.
Dang.
Just to finish Thomas Powell's story, when he got the 200 men back to Deal, out of his own pocket, he paid for them to be fed and lodged for the night. He also paid for the burial of those sailors who had died once he had brought them ashore. Finally, and out of his own pocket again, he paid for the sailors to travel on to the naval base at Gravesend. And what did the government do? Well, grudgingly, after many months of badgering, the government finally agreed to reimburse him for his out-of-pocket expenses for saving 200 of Her Majesty's sailors. One last story I'll leave you with, just to emphasise the power of the wind in the English Channel.
Government's
and
gonna
the North Sea
government,
that
I guess.
night, was the story of HMS Association. Captained by Sir Stafford Fairborn, the Association was anchored just off Harwich in Essex. Like many other ships that night, she too was torn from her anchor. But in her case, the Association wasn't driven onto the rocks or onto a submerged sandbank. Oh no, she was driven all the way across the North Sea, ending up on the coast of Sweden. The night of the 26th of November 1703, the Royal Navy lost 13 ships around the coast of Wales and England, and 6,000 sailors. That's something approaching 10% of her entire strength. And this at a time when England and Scotland was at war with France. It was estimated at the time that the cost of the damage from the Great Storm was £6 million in 1703 money.
Yeah.
The impact on agriculture was enormous. I've already mentioned the loss of the 15,000 sheep down in Somerset. Well, in Kent and Sussex, sheep couldn't even graze on the grass because so much salt had been carried in on the air from the sea. Meanwhile, cider apple orchards in Herefordshire, Gloucestershire and Somerset had been decimated. Queen Anne said
all
the Great
flooding.
Storm of 1703 was a calamity so dreadful and astonishing that the like hath not been seen or felt in the memory of any person living in this kingdom. With meteorology in its infancy, how could people in 1703 understand what had just happened to them? Well, it was an age where people still had great religious faith, and they turned to God for an answer. And the Church of England were only too happy to oblige. They told everyone that it was the wrath of God for the sins of the nation. It depends which sermon you then listen to as to quite what his wrath was about. Supposedly, God was angry about atheism. He was also angry about people going to the theatre. He was also angry about people believing in science. He was even angry about the lacklustre performance of Britain in the War of Spanish Succession, fighting Catholic France. It's a sort of reflection on the times that Parliament itself, a week afterwards, declared a day not of national mourning, like we might have nowadays, but a day of national repentance.
Oh my gosh.
The Great Storm of 1703 has been largely forgotten by the modern public. In fact, it would have been even more forgotten if Daniel Defoe hadn't taken it upon himself to tour the country, visiting the sites of destruction and gathering witness statements. The book that he published containing those accounts, entitled The Storm, gave him a taste for writing. And 16 years later, Daniel Defoe published Robinson Crusoe. The storm of 1987 was actually stronger in wind speeds than the storm recorded by Defoe. But in 1987, 18, some sources claim 22, people lost their lives. In 1703, 10,000 lost theirs. To put that into some sort of context, that's over twice as many Allied soldiers who died on D-Day in 1944. And the Royal Navy lost more ships during the storm than they did to enemy action in the War of Spanish Succession. With the scale of destruction on land and sea, the horrifying stories of those men stranded on the Goodwin Sands, and the sheer scale of overall lives lost, the storm of the 26th of November 1703 rightly bears the title, The Great Storm. There are so many great stories from British history. In fact, why not watch another one of my videos that are popping up on the screen right now?
Please go and do that. Go support Chris on his channel. He's got so many cool videos. This is, I mean, yeah, the storm was pretty bad. You wonder if a storm like that, what it were to hit today, what the damage would be. I'm sure there would be extensive flooding, of course. I'm sure the loss of life, but I can't imagine it would be in the thousands. Maybe, I don't know. I would like to think that we're a little more as a species prepared for that sort of thing, but you get stuff like we had here, Katrina, with the flooding and stuff like that. It just cause if it's the perfect combination of things. But back then, the way things were constructed, it sounds like a lot of towers and chimneys and so on had collapse, which then brings a lot of the other things. The knowledge of certain things that allows us to avoid certain areas, maybe. But yeah, it's always interesting of looking back on some of these natural disasters, and then maybe somewhat compare them on today. People have the knowledge today of certain things that probably can help in a lot of this. So it's but gosh, so much loss of life, of animals, of ships, of course. Incredible. Hope you enjoyed that and learned something today. I know you're having some serious weather. It's cold, and so I encourage you to bundle up and stay warm. I pray that things aren't that bad for you, but at least you're not dealing with what they dealt with back in the day. I mean, yeah, interesting. And no matter what part of history, it always seems like the cow is going to end up in the tree. Hope everybody's happy, healthy, and safe. Thanks so much for coming. I appreciate all of you. I look forward to reading what you have to add to this, and we will see you in the next one. Take care, everybody, and bye-bye.
Mark from the States, Mark from the States, it's Mark